There's a whole lot more to ceramics than using a potter's wheel, but many people want to master this technique, so I'm going to show you the basics here. The first thing I'm doing here is I'm wedging some clay. That's the term that we use when we throw it down on a slab like this. My slab is made out of plaster and it helps dry out the outside, but by doing this we also align the fibers in the clay as well as getting rid of air bubbles and try to make sure that it has a consistent texture and hardness all the way through. I'm going to use a piece of fishing line here to show you that there are no air bubbles in this clay. You can see that it's solid all the way through. And now that I've cut it, I need to wedge it a couple more times to make sure that it's all one piece. Remember that clay is always strongest when it's one piece, and putting something on the wheel makes it all one piece. When we make a pot on the wheel, we call the process throwing. Here's my potter's wheel. It's electric, and you'll see that I have a bat that is held steady by two posts. And you'll see that there are concentric rings on the top. That's because I scored them in there to make sure that I can help center this piece of clay. The first thing we do is we make it into mostly a ball. We push it down on the dry top if we can, and then we are going to what we call center the clay. This takes quite a bit of strength, and it's mostly done with my right hand. By plopping the wet clay down onto the dry surface, it helps it stick to that surface. So the bat, which is the top part of this, when it turns, will turn the clay as well. I want to press down and I want to press in from the sides, making sure that I'm always pressing towards center. Now I have a tendency to steady my hands by putting my elbows and locking them into my knees. Many people do this, it's fine. The trick here is to get it centered as quickly as you can, but sometimes it will take quite a bit of time. You'll see that I'm pulling it up into sort of an inverted cone as I do it, and it's more important that I have the top centered first than the bottom. So I press down, I pull up until I get this into sort of a pyramidal shape, sort of an inverted cone, and I usually have a very flat top on it as well with my thumb across the top. Then I'm going to take my thumb and I'm going to burrow a little hole right in the top of it once I get it centered. Now it doesn't look like the bottom is entirely centered, but I'm not worried about that. That's what I'm going to trim off later. But the top of it and the middle, I want that as perfectly centered as possible. You'll see that I'm constantly adding water to this. That's because I need a relatively frictionless surface. If there's friction, then I get problems and it wobbles and it warps, and as soon as it gets out of balance, it has a tendency to fling out to the sides. I have this at actual speed at the moment. Usually I speed my videos up, but I thought that it would be good to see this at actual speed of how long it takes someone who actually had a plan before they started this of making a cylinder. You'll see that there's a little bit of luff at the top there as well. That's because I had a little bit of an unbalance in there and I pulled it to the top of the pot, and now I'm going to pull that off by using a needle tool and my finger, and I'm just going to make a donut off the top here as it goes around and round, pressing in just a little bit more each time around until finally it flies off in my hand or against the side walls, or maybe up in my face. You never know sometimes. So you can see I pulled quite a bit of that off, didn't quite get all of it, because I know that there's a lump in the side that I can feel. Even though I wedged these scraps a couple of times, there's still a little bit of a lump in there, and I'm trying to get that out. You'll usually do best, if you haven't done this before, with new clay right out of the bag. New clay usually has the best moisture levels and consistency of material right out of the bag for throwing on a wheel. In this case, I did it all by feel, and I'm a little bit off, as you can see from the little bit of luff that I've again pulled to the top here, because I have a little bit of a harder lump in one of the walls. But I'm going to deal with that just by pulling a couple of donuts off the top to make sure that I can get it nice and balanced again. I have to do this very slowly, because if I do it quickly, I'll just make the whole thing go flop, and then I'll have to start all over again. At this point, I'm going to double the speed of the video so you can see the process without having to wait the entire time. You can see that by keeping slip and water on my hands, I try to make a frictionless surface, and when I press from the inside, I usually support from the outside as well, because I don't want anything to go flying. I usually use my thumbs on the inside, but I can use my fingers. Now I'm using a wire loop to pull pieces off of the outside like it's a lathe. You'll see that I'm supporting my right hand with my left hand to make sure that it's as steady as I can get it, and the pieces tend to fly off. If they don't fly off, you're cutting too deep. You can only do a little bit at a time. So I am going to smooth out the inside, smooth out the outside, and try to make sure that this is as perfect a cylinder as I can get at this point in time. It's a good size for a large mug is what I've got. And I can trim off little pieces. You'll see that I'm using 2 hands usually on that loop when I do it, and I'm using a lot of moisture still to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. I'll also use a sponge eventually to take the water out of the inside, because this is going to have to dry for a while before I can remove it from that pat. So here you see that I'm just adjusting it a little bit, getting it smooth where I can, making sure that everything is just the way I want it to be, a simple cylinder. And then I'm going to remove the moisture from the inside using that sponge, smooth down the edges, and then I'm going to stop it, and it's done. I need to let this dry. Now it's too wet to do anything else with at the moment, but I need to let it dry for a few hours so that I can actually put it back on the wheel. Now this is one of the pots that I turned earlier, and it's been about 4 or 5, maybe 6 hours, so that it's dried out a little bit. And I'm going to use a piece of fishing line, and I'm going to cut it off of here. I already did this earlier to make sure that it was freed from the base, but it's restuck itself. So I'm going to make sure that it's detached, and then I'm putting my fingerprints and basically marring up the bottom with my hands. It's still a bit wet, and as you can see, I have a ring here on this bat already from a previous pot that I trimmed. I'm going to show you how to trim this one. And to do that, I'm going to first center it. I'm putting my finger on the side, you can see, and wherever it bumps my finger, I know that needs to go a little bit closer to the center. And I'm going to use this loop as basically a stick, and I'm going to hang out at the very outside edge of where it's turning and just mark a little mark on the side so I can see what needs to move closer to center. I move it away from the mark on the outside, and then I put my finger on top and it smooths out the mark again, and I can feel if it's centered by when it goes all the way around. If it bumps my finger over and over again, I know it's not centered. Now I'm going to take these pieces of clay and I'm going to stick them around to stabilize the cylinder. Remember, it's face down and it's not actually stuck to that bat below there. I'm going to press straight down on these, not pressing them in, but pressing them down and letting them spread into the surface all the way around. And as I push each one down, I want to make sure I don't move that. And I'm going to do this at a slow speed just to make sure that everything is nice and set. And now I have a little bit of stability, and these pieces will stick to that dry bat and hold that in place to some extent. And I can take off a little bit of the bottom. I want to turn a foot on this. Now, many individuals like to leave a flat base because they don't know how much space there is between the clay at the bottom of the bowl that they made and on the outside, and they don't want to go all the way through. Some people like to throw their pots so that their bases are very close to the bottom to begin with. I personally like to leave a little bit of space so I have something to grab onto, and then I try to visualize the space inside, making sure that I don't go through the bottom. It usually works with that visualization. You can see that I'm using this like a vertical lathe. I'm steadying my right hand with my left quite often, and I'm just pulling off scraps. I'm not going at full speed. I'm going at a slower speed here, and I'm letting the wheel do all the work, taking off little pieces at a time. If I try to take off too much, it will cause too much friction and the whole pot will go flying. I don't want that to happen, because then I have to start over by turning an entirely new pot, not just turning a foot like I'm doing now. Now, to turn the foot, I'm going to round off the bottom like this, just by taking off little bits and pieces, and then eventually I'm going to turn the inside of it as well and take it down so that it's thinner on the bottom, because if it's too thick in some areas and too thin in some areas, it might dry unevenly and cause more cracking, and I don't want to do that. So here I am rounding off the bottom of this pot gently, a little bit at a time. Up until this point, turning the foot, I've been doing it at actual speed. In this case, I'm going to take it to 4 times the original speed, so it's going to look faster than it actually is. That way you don't have to sit here waiting for the entire process to go through. You can see that I'm pulling the foot on the inside, and I'm going to raise the bottom underneath it, leaving a ring on the outside of the pot. I take off little tiny scraps as I go along. Some of those scraps fly off and get caught in the sides. Others are going into my hand. Clay itself is infinitely recyclable, so this stuff that's going into my hand or off to the side when I collect it will eventually become another pot somewhere down the line or some other piece of sculpture. You can see here that I am actually turning this as if it were a coil on the bottom. I cut a little piece extra on the side. I'm putting a little tiny bit of water on there just to smooth it out. I'm not pressing down hard. I'm just taking off little pieces as it goes around. The whole idea is to turn the foot so that it looks nice and neat like this. Next, I'm going to sign my work. I'm using these little fondant stamps. Normally they're held in a bracket to keep them nice and neat and even, but I'm just using them one at a time to put my initials in the bottom of this pot, and I'm going to put the year as a Roman numeral as well, just making sure that it's nice and neat and I don't poke all the way through the bottom into the pot. Don't want to compromise that. And removing the supports, I can turn it over. This is what the shape of the pot will look like eventually. Now I could use this as a bowl or a pot, or I could put a handle on it and use it as a mug. It's about the right size for a relatively large mug. It will shrink in the drying process, but not a whole lot. Here's what those pots ended up looking like after they were bisque fired, then glazed and glaze fired. Here are a few turned feet for you to see. You'll note that the less clay that actually sits on the tabletop, the less you have to worry about a warped bottom making things wobble.